In 2008, audiences and critics were pretty confused and unimpressed by the theatrically released The Clone Wars film, unaware it was set up to a later series that would reach widespread acclaim. With the films and series release came all the merchandise and expanded materials that was expected of Star Wars for the time, like tie-in books, toys, video games, and a comic series published by Dark Horse, who had been printing Star Wars comics since 1991. The first story arc, known as Slaves of the Republic, was penned by the Clone Wars writer Henry Gilroy, and penciled, inked, and coloured by a team of skilled artists. Intended to be a story in the animated series, it was determined to be too ambitious for the then fledgling studio, Lucasfilm Animation, to take on. By the time of 2011's Season 4, Slaves of the Republic had made it to television, similar in many respects and different in many others. Hello and welcome to Compare the Pair. I'm Royce. Let's explore Slaves of the Republic in excruciating detail and try to see how they justify this. The comic series began publishing on the 10th of September 2008, with issue 1 subtitled The Mystery of Kiros. The comic would ultimately run over 6 issues, published every 2 months, while the animated arc ran for 3 episodes, beginning with Kidnapped on the 25th of November 2011. Both start with your opening crawls, one in text and one spoken by the announcer, with the episode starting with the customary proverb hinting to the episode's theme. On the world of Kiros we find a pacifist Togrutan colony, the leader Roshti deep in conversation with Yoda about their peaceful society, and how it's about to come to an end with the arrival of the Separatists. The dialogue that's carried over from the comic is almost verbatim, and it continues this way into Dooku's arrival, but it does cut whole panels of dialogue that gives greater context to the invasion. Roshti gives up way too quick in the animation, not even arguing to try and dissuade the invasion, while Dooku gives his reassurances, but comes across as more evidently menacing in the show. No room for subtlety here. The villains of the show have to be cartoonishly evil. The visual differences are extreme. Roshti obviously looks quite different, and Kiros is almost Mesoamerican in appearance on the page, a lush paradise vibrant and rich with colour, while on the show it's entirely original modernist structures, sort of like the Sydney Opera House crossed with the appearance of the Togrutan's horns. The entire planet is saturated in a yellow glow that seemed to be favoured by the program, and across countless other planets like those seen in this very story arc. Personally, I don't find it the most appealing. It might have been one of the shortcomings of the animations at the time, as later animated shows had far more variety in how they depicted and lit these alien worlds. The yellow lighting is present in the comic too, but only comes about following the invasion. The tones are drastically different. The horror of the Togrutan citizens is pretty evident in the comic, but maybe it's another shortcoming of the animations, as all these guys just sort of stand there and look a bit shocked and surprised. It's nothing really dynamic to them. While comic Dooku descends the ramp of what looks like his solar sailor in the illustrations, the program has him arrive by one of the landing craft, and takes this opportunity to establish the villains of this episode in the form of the tactical droid and the Zygarian slaver. Another major difference between the two versions of the slave story is the design of the main antagonists. The Zygarians existed in Star Wars canon for many years prior to the Slaves of the Republic comic, first being written about in 1987's The Star Wars Sourcebook. However, a 2005 entry in the Star Wars Miniatures game referred to a character from a 1979 Star Wars comic as being Zygarian, retroactively extending their canonicity back to the 27th Marvel Star Wars comic, one of the earliest pieces of expanded universe material. Good grief, we're going deep. When it came time to adapt the comic to the show, the production decided to redesign the Zygarians into something more unique, drawing upon the looks of coyotes and further strengthening Dave Filoni's bond to wolves and wolfish creatures. Largely, I think it's a change for the better, as it elevates them from Star Trek-like aliens with strange foreheads to something that stands out a lot more. The comic throws us right into the action. 19 rotations, or days later, the Republic is here and Obi-Wan, Anakin, Ahsoka and Rex are cutting their way through battle droids, making a game of it. In the show, we see their arrival 10 rotations since the invasion, and the action is a much more sombre affair. Our heroes ride bark speeders with sidecars in both, Rex being paired up with Obi-Wan, a detail carried over from the comic, but instead of finding them mid-battle, their arrival is eerily quiet, before an action scene with bike-riding commando droids. Visual differences in characters are extreme, with the comic having the designs of the films in the first 2.5 seasons, while the characters' looks had upgraded almost a season before on the show. The story takes place at different times during the war, with the comic having it take place early on, presumably shortly after the film, while the animation seems to place it in the latter half. Clones mostly carry their Phase 1 looks in the comic, with the exception of a jet trooper who apparently isn't Commander Cody, while they're wearing Phase 2 armour in the show. Commando droids, or BX battle droids, wouldn't be introduced in the canon for a few more months after the comic's publishing, so none of them appear here. These are the first of many changes as a result of the timeline shift to take place between the two different versions of the story. Action-wise, things are about the same, Rex taking out a tank in both, but in the show without the jovial scorekeeping of the comic. Despite this, the comic takes time for Ahsoka to reflect upon the destruction they're causing, how this places her culture, and it's her people whose lives are in jeopardy. Anakin offers some words of reassurance and encouragement, while there's no such thing in the show. Cody does appear in the animation, however, to announce to Obi-Wan he has a message from the Separatist commander, requesting Kenobi's presence. Anakin reacts badly to the appearance of the Zygarian, prompting Ahsoka to question Obi-Wan and the revelation to her of Anakin's childhood as a slave. This reveal doesn't come until later in the comic story, but because of both versions' different placements in the timeline, it means the Ahsoka of the TV show has gone some time really not getting to know her master as well as we had assumed. The Separatist commanders are different in both. In the comics, the commander is a four-armed basilisk idiot named Zygris Ugg, while on the show it's a Zygarian slaver called Darts Dinar. This change was made because of the episode that preceded Kidnapped, Carnage of Krell, featured a villainous basilisk Jedi, Pong Krell. I guess wanting to avoid basilisk saturation, Ugg was removed. A shame because I wanted to see this jerk plummet to his death in 3D. Ugg calls upon Obi-Wan specifically, calling him the Negotiator, tying back to the Separatist nickname for him from Revenge of the Sith. Annoyingly, Ugg refuses to negotiate or play by the rules, threatening to detonate these huge thermal detonator-styled explosives hidden throughout the city, leading to Ahsoka and Anakin racing to track them down. Zygarian Darts Dinar uses the same tactic in the show, now with different explosives, going so far as to detonate one to prove he means business. Obi-Wan tries to stall Ugg by agreeing to Ugg's proposed fistfight, on the condition Ugg reveals the location of the kidnapped Togruta. The animation Zygarian Darts Dinar has a similar interaction, now with more animal peril and a face-to-face hologram meeting for Obi-Wan and Dooku. Obi-Wan instead suggests the fistfight with Dinar, following the surrender of his lightsaber in wake of the explosive, and Dinar cursing the Jedi for past grievances, that being the destruction of the former slaving empire. Anakin and Ahsoka now race off in separate AT-RT walkers, Anakin expressing hopes that Obi-Wan can buy them some time. The bomb defusing is left up to Ahsoka in the comic, who identifies the trigger with Anakin's help, and severs it with a cut from her lightsaber. Anakin's approach in the series is much more direct, telling her to trust her instincts. Comic Anakin continues to encourage Ahsoka by directing her worry for her people's safety towards defusing the bombs. Obi-Wan's fight with Ugg seems a lot more balanced. Despite being caught off guard and thrown through a desk, he seems to be toying with a much larger basilisk. The fight with Dinar is far more one-sided. Despite being about the same size as Kenobi, the Zygarian is far more powerful, dramatically monologuing about the loss of his slave empire. Despite progress being hampered by droidicus snipers in both, designs differing dramatically, Anakin calls on Rex, who snipes the sniper, while the show has Anakin and Ahsoka working together to defeat them and disarm the bombs simultaneously. With a battle droid contacting the Separatist commander to inform them the Jedi have disabled the explosives, Ugg discovers to his horror that Anakin and Ahsoka must have moved one aboard his escape craft. Dinar, meanwhile, is furious to see there are no bombs left, grabbing his tactical droid and revealing a bomb hidden within that. It's the droid that Obi-Wan throws through the window as Dinar escapes, while Ugg is hurled out the window in the comic, his dying breath reveling in the fact that he'll take the information Kenobi is after with him. Perhaps the manner of death was deemed to be too much for a flesh and blood character in the animation, resulting in the tactical droid's inclusion. In the comic, our heroes learn of the Zygarians' involvement through Ugg's transmission records, coupled with a hologram message from Admiral Yularen. The program ends with a similar message from Yularen, but not before a chase between Dinar, Anakin, and Ahsoka, combining elements from comic issue 2. Slave Traders of Zygaria begins with our heroes on a capital ship above the eerily empty Kiros, to learn the vanishing of the Togruta has been pinned on the Jedi through separatist propaganda. Learning of the Zygarians' involvement from Obi-Wan, Yoda reflects upon past wars that saw the slaving empire dismantled, complete with flashbacks. No such flashbacks exist in the show, but the appearance of alien Keldor Plo Koon is perhaps a nod to the Keldor Jedi seen in the comics. Fearing the Togruta might have been enslaved, it's here in the comic that Ahsoka learns of Anakin's past, and together they hatch a plan. Piloting Anakin's junker of a ship, the Twilight, introduced in the Clone Wars film, they happen upon a Zygarian ship hidden in an asteroid field, the remnants of a world obliterated long ago by comet strike, now rife with criminal activity. Under the guise of prospective buyers, the Jedi and clones get aboard the slaver's ship, only to become decoupled and resulting in Ahsoka's capture. Anticipating the Jedi's return for a prisoner exchange, the Zygarians release their tentacled creature, the Blixus. Fighting the Jedi in the vacuum of space, this same creature, now redesigned, is what fights Anakin and Ahsoka aboard Dinar's ship in the show. Getting aboard the Zygarian's ship, with some weird racial jokes, the Jedi finally find out where the occupants of Kiros have been taken, a slave auction, and decide to use this captured ship as their way in. I'm a little alarmed by the flippancy here, Anakin stating Ahsoka will play the part of a slave well, but I do appreciate the friendliness as they're quite stiff and repressed at times in the show. The relationship matured as the series went on. The quipping from the movie, early seasons, and this comic was toned down a lot as it annoyed older viewers. It worked out well by rolling into Ahsoka's character development, leading to her becoming one of the series' most beloved characters. When this comic was released, people wished she'd hurried up and die already. Yeah, let it be known that many people hated Ahsoka when she first appeared. I was about the same age she was written to be when the film, show and comic came out, 14, and I never really had a problem with her. But growing up as the series has, I can see and appreciate the changes made. Elements of issue 2 appear in the show, with the Zygarian Captain Onyx rolled in with Ugg to create Darts Dinar, but then again, the stories aren't totally aligned. Issue 3, The Depths of Zygaria, and Episode 2, Slaves of the Republic, begin with the crew arriving aboard the Zygarian ship outside the slaver's homeworld. In the comic, it shows them aware they're about to enter a slaver's auction, while the series still has them in the dark, but dressed for the occasion in both. Anakin's flippancy last issue is forgotten. Slavery is once again no laughing matter for him, but Ahsoka is more than willing to be the prop to sell their deception. In the series, she protests, less than pleased about the arrangement. Little differences, like Ahsoka hiding their lightsabers with R2, is changed to Anakin suggesting it, as well as some changes to the Zygarian architecture, but elements like the dialogue, the colour palette and the lighting remain about the same. The two plots follow the same basic flow. Arriving in the slaver's city, Ahsoka grabs the wrist of a raised whipcracker, leading to Anakin stepping in. With the fight due to break out, a probe droid breaks it up and Anakin is brought before the Zygarian Queen, Mirage Sintel. Ahsoka is presented to the Queen, Obi-Wan is caught trying to free Roshti astride a large animal, is identified as a Jedi and tortured, and Sintel's slave tries attacking the Queen before leaping to her death. Pleasant stuff. There are a number of differences between the two, which is, to be expected. Human or humanoid slaves are swapped for Twi'leks, who seem to be the go-to slave species of the old continuity. Ahsoka joins Obi-Wan and Rex in locating Roshti and leads a long chase through the city, leading to her and Rex splitting up from Obi-Wan and enacting the kidnapped Togruta princess route, to Anakin's surprise. The chase ends much more quickly for Rex and Obi-Wan. The animation has Ahsoka accompany Anakin to the palace simply as his slave, condensing the interactions with the Queen significantly. Anakin adopts the name Lars Quell in both. In the comic, he doesn't really play along with the Queen's demands and insists upon his importance, keeping her waiting quite a while before Ahsoka's arrival to show the merchandise. The series has him more flirtatious and eager to please, insisting he killed an unseen rival of Sintel's named Bruno Denturi. comic Ahsoka doesn't drop her slave princess act, which Anakin praises, while in the show she seems a lot more uncertain. The outfit was, I guess, the thing this series is most famous for, and probably the only thing people were really interested in going into this adaptation.
It's a bit, yep. That's a minor.
Well, how about the actual comic book when she was 14? Because the comic book came out a few years before and it was set earlier in the war.
I'm worried.
Yeah.
That is a 16-year-old child. What is wrong with you people?
This one's 14.
Oh,
yeah, bit weird. Bit weird, eh?
I don't know who the artist was, but I hope they're on some kind of list.
Bit weird. It's not all that more revealing than her regular outfit, which already stirred up considerable controversy and strong reactions from those for and against it. The animation's outfit is a lot more intricate in design. The decisions to use the colours they did really complements Ahsoka's skin tone, which I think would have considerable impact on her outfits going forwards, but I'll be going deeper into that in a future video. While the episode continues, we now move on to issue 4, Auction of 1,000,000 Souls. The slave auction begins. To the show's heroes, they only learnt of this event from the Queen, and we see all manner of beings amongst the audience and Zygarian forces. The amount of Togrutan prisoners has been significantly reduced for the show, from 8 million in the comics to 50,000. Separatist members in attendance are switched, presumably to ones the show already had character models for, and comic Queen Sintel reveals it's the Separatists themselves, allowing for the mass slavery production to be possible. As Obi-Wan is brought before the crowd, Anakin as Lars Quell is ordered to whip him into submission. Obi-Wan of the show doesn't really get a chance to talk with the Queen before the Return of a Jedi-style escape plan, complete with music cues, is put into action. The attempt is ultimately unsuccessful, the comics far more destructive to the arena, and Queen Sintel herself beats Anakin into unconsciousness. The comic features a holocall between Sintel and Dooku, who's displeased with her openness with the slave auction and orders the execution of both Jedi. The series skips this and we cut to the next scene, the comic almost acting as a storyboard for the show. As Anakin awakes in the Queen's quarters, he initially throttles her through the Force, before begrudgingly agreeing to be her servant to keep his friends safe. Ahsoka is shown to be imprisoned in a cage, dangling over the city and in meditation in the animation, proving to her Zygarian captor she'll be less than compliant. On the planet Cadavo, great lava craters dominating the landscape, we see where Obi-Wan and Rex have been transported, but the story continues into issue 5. A slave now, a slave forever. Brought before the overweight and disabled Keeper Agris at the Zygarian Processing Center, the Keeper makes an example of the Togrutan prisoners as a threat to Obi-Wan if he misbehaves. The biggest loss from across the comic is a huge amount of Kenobi's dialogue. He's made far less active in the series. A drop into the lava pits is a truly gruesome way to go. I was pretty horrified to see this the first time. It's swapped to a drop into a bottomless pit for the series. I guess the uncertainty of their fates is more palatable for a Cartoon Network audience. Yeah, remember the Clone Wars originally aired on Cartoon Network? Disney might have nabbed the program from them, but who still has a channel on Foxtel now? Sintel and Anakin go for a romantic flight, the dragons in the series being the same beast that Obi-Wan tried to flee on earlier in the episode, and comic Sintel has her dressed in full riding gear, which is sadly absent from the show, as is a scene where Anakin is shown to be working as her bodyguard, defending her from attacks by rival criminals. The dialogue of Anakin's past as a slave is brought up here, and as we see Kenobi forced to work in a smelter room, we get a scene with Dooku in conversation with Sidious, warning him to keep a hold of the Kiros Togrutan slaves and ignore Skywalker. In the show, Sidious instead comments upon the threat the Queen's non-compliance poses. Here we get another change with the introduction of Asajj Ventress, who's entirely absent from the series. Thanks to the change in timeline placement between these two versions of the story, events from across the larger series would have a significant impact. In the series, Ventress had left Dooku's service, conspiring against him with her Night Sister allies in finding the Sith a replacement assassin. This would then lead to the return of Darth Maul later this season. In the comics, this early in the war, Ventress is still Dooku's servant, constantly failing despite her best efforts. Ahsoka's cage dangling appears in issue 5, where she's freed by Anakin moments before Ventress arrives. Dooku meets with the Queen, her advisor displeased that she's taken on Anakin as a slave. She explains, with cutaways to Obi-Wan's suffering, what message this sends to the galaxy at large, but Dooku is unimpressed. Events largely happen the same here, with a few changes to the placement of information, but Dooku strangles the Queen with the intent to pin it on Skywalker. Ventress joins in the duel in the comic, and Anakin flees by leaping from the window to a ship commandeered by Ahsoka and R2-D2. In the comic, it's Dooku's own solar sailor, while it's another Zygarian ship in the show. The Queen dies in Anakin's arms in both versions, Anakin flinging Dooku out of frame to stop her choking, as she muses with her last breath how dedicated Anakin is to his friends, before revealing the location of Obi-Wan. From here, the duel takes place, and Anakin escapes. In the animation, Anakin, initially without his lightsaber, uses one of the Zygarians' laser whips in his duel with Dooku, before grabbing the Queen's body and escaping. On the floor of the slaver's ship, the Queen dies, musing in both versions slightly different sentiments. Anakin was right, she says. Even she had a master, but it wasn't Dooku, but her heart. It's all very strange. I guess the extra issues and bi-monthly release schedule justified some feelings being developed in the comics, while the show's Queen Sintel simply comes to the realization she too was a slave. The comic issue ends with the declaration from Dooku that the slaves of Kiros, all 8 million of them, must die to prevent his lies from being exposed. Leaping into issue 6, Escape from Cadavo, and the final 10 minutes of the episode of the same name, we get more differences between the two versions. In the Turbine Rooms, Obi-Wan strengthens morale in the Togruta with the revelation of Kiros' liberation from Separatist forces. This spark of hope is noticed in the Harkonnen wannabe Agris, who calls Rex and Obi-Wan before him, before commencing a mass purge of Kiros prisoners as punishment. In the series, Dooku is on call with Agris, and Obi-Wan is again robbed of a cool or heroic act of defiance, brought before the Keeper to begin termination. Dooku's presence and continued support for the Zygarians emboldens the Keeper, who is much more determined to kill the slaves and spite Obi-Wan personally. Outside, Anakin and Ahsoka arrive with clone backup, but it's just them and R2 in the show. A little detail I noticed last episode with the arrival of the slaver ship was the turrets remaining trained on the ship as it landed, setting up this moment as they let off a barrage against the ship and the Jedi when they're found out. Reinforcements arrive shortly after, and Plo Koon's cameo amongst the fighters in the comics is greatly expanded, to the detriment of Obi-Wan's own character, which is a bit of a shame. Fighting breaks out between Republic and Separatist ships, Ventress's squid ship first spotted in the Clone Wars film taking part. Keeper Agris is horrified to learn that Dooku is willing to kill him to cover his lies, being pushed aside by Obi-Wan as he breaks free. Meanwhile, Agris of the show does all he can to stop Obi-Wan, eventually dying by javelin to the chest, lobbed by a very annoyed Captain Rex. Kiros prisoners are saved from a drop to death with the help of Jedi, clones, and the careful placement of a ship. The comic Separatists are driven off and the day is saved, while the Republic destroys the facility in a blaze. In the quiet following the battle, Obi-Wan and Anakin have a heart-to-heart, Kenobi realizing he somewhat overlooked the suffering Anakin must have gone through as a child slave. Having only had to live through a few days of it, he feels he took his former Padawan for granted. Agris is revealed to be alive and set for a Republic prison for his own crimes of slavery. There's probably a clever comment I could make here about incarceration being a modern-day form of slavery, creating a bit of an ironic moment here, and I wonder if that was indeed intentional on behalf of the writers back in 2008. But I'll just say it and leave it at that. 4 days later, and the last of the 8 million Kiros Togruta are ready to be taken back home. A mysterious message from Palpatine is received asking the slave processing center be preserved. All in attendance disagree, and the center is destroyed. Back on Kiros, Roshti meets with Yoda, noting that continued Republic protection can only go so far, and reflecting upon how this whole ordeal has prompted his once pacifist people into wanting to learn how to defend themselves. It's quite a grim moment. Amidst the clean-up of the previous battle on the final page, Ahsoka reflects upon Obi-Wan's words from Issue 4, and wonders if the Jedi are indeed slaves of the Republic. Together, she and Anakin vow to rid the galaxy of slavery, or at very least do their part in this gigantic fight. I hope they succeed. The final scene of the episode takes place upon the ultra-desaturated hangar of the Venator Star Destroyer. Ahsoka's creative thinking during the escape is credited for the survival of the people of Kiros, and Rushdie asks to speak with Ahsoka in private. He thanks her for the deed of saving her people, the only other mention in these episodes of that racial connection, as he worries his people will never recover from the horrors they faced. Ahsoka remarks that surviving it will allow them to grow stronger, and the episode ends with Rushdie remarking that perhaps the independent Kiros will join the Republic. As you can see, quite a few differences between the two. The basic framework of the story is there, but there's several changes to the tone which radically alters the context of the story. Both versions have their highs and lows, and trying to decide which I prefer is tricky. I don't know if my more modern viewpoint altered my reading of the comic to be more satirical than it was probably intended. These are comics that would presumably be read by all ages. A lot of the satire, if intended, would go over younger readers' heads, and perhaps even that of older readers at the time. Ahsoka is a lot more lively in the comics, maybe even more so than she was in the animations in those early seasons. Important moments of character and humour were largely missed from the animated episodes. For both Ahsoka and Obi-Wan, he's really stripped of any glory, which is a change I don't quite understand. Any awesome moment from his in the comic, like holding himself against a large foe and overpowering him with a quip, has him bashed about by a far less interesting one. The long chase is cut hilariously short. His moment of defiance while shackled on his knees is turned into a tragic moment. Anakin carrying the whip of oppression that he's been on the receiving end of is switched to, "Oh gee, Master, looks like I have to save you again." Now actually I've made up my mind that the comic version, with a few exceptions, is the superior version. The redesign of the Zygarians is unique, bringing furries or werewolves into the canon, although we already had those, but the comic certainly didn't slack in creating diverse looks for these foes. I feel there's far more evil and cruelty to the more humanoid designs. Maybe making them less human removes them from dangers of any real-world comparisons. Comic books have always been able to achieve incredible visuals on a budget a tiny fraction of the biggest comic book films, and I wondered if the animation, now it doesn't just have to draw these vistas, but model, rig, animate and render them, would lead to some shortcomings. A story with this scale and scope and environmental detail probably wouldn't have been possible for the Clone Wars Season 1. But from Season 2 onwards, and especially by Season 4, they'd improved by leaps and bounds. While the vistas of the comics aren't 100% translated to animation, the replacements more than match the scale and scope seen on the page. The shortcomings of animation and crowd scenes I pointed to in Episode 1 were more than made up for by the mine scenes of Episode 3. Upgrades to designs are appreciated, especially as some of the colouring is a bit shaky across some of the issues. Sure, some might not like the art styles on the page. I found the Queen's intro in issue 3 to be a bit flat, but later in the same issue, it featured some super expressive art of Ahsoka. Later appearances from different artists across the series brought varying degrees of expression and energy. Plo Koon's cameo is changed to a whole feature, a display of his brilliance, which is such a shame when Obi-Wan is robbed of anything. Dave Filoni's favourite character is Plo Koon, and with that in mind, it really feels like these moments were for him, at the cost of everything else. I wonder if some of the changes were made because the original was deemed to be too inappropriate. Star Wars before Disney could get a bit inappropriately horny, with scantily clad comic and video game characters, Hutt Slayer statues, and pens where Leia's dress fell off when you tipped it upside down. Dressing Anakin's 14-year-old apprentice in her own version of the Hutt Slayer, even if it's more covered than a regular outfit, is a symptom of that inappropriate horniness. There's a time and a place for horniness, and this certainly wasn't it. Ahsoka going from willing to play the part of a slave and playing that part quite well, and begrudgingly going along and doing a poor job of it feels like the writers were like, well, we can't have her volunteer and want to be a part of it. What message does that send? Anakin is made more flirtatious with the Queen, which I thought would lead to her falling in love with him as in the comics, but then that moment is really toned down. Do you want a stern and haunted Anakin who tries to lighten the mood and help his young apprentice in the face of such darkness? Or do you want an Anakin letting his Vader really show, and then try and get it on with a furry? Villains are villainous in both versions, but there's much more variety to villainy in the comics, not just in the case of Onyx and Ugg being rolled into Dart's Dinar, or that Ventress is missing. Her absence isn't really felt. In the comics she acts as a bit of potential peril, but that doesn't really amount to much. I mean more in terms of villain qualities and quality villainy. Any subtlety feels like it's stripped from the show.
I am mad that I can no longer enslave and subjugate people, Jedi. I blame you personally for this.
Ho 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 ho. I am the lesser of two evils.
And the defeat of Keeper Agris is reduced to a "and the crowd clapped" moment when Rex takes him out. It feels very childish in a series of episodes stripped of these things that others might call childish, like all the banter and jokes that Anakin and Ahsoka have. And I know it's a kids show, but these episodes are dealing with slavery, of robbing people of their personhood, where anything interesting like the villains who try to justify it beyond just being evil, and the heroes who counter their arguments are stripped away. In fact, these episodes are so stripped back, they feel especially lacking in comparison to those that surround it. I was amazed when I was younger watching the Clone Wars that they could fit so much plot into 20 minutes. Watching it now, I realise they do that by just rushing through scenes. There's very little flowery dialogue. It's direct and to the point. The episode does take some cracking moments of dialogue from the comic and applies it well, but in that case it's just using the comic as a storyboard. In the wake of live-action Ahsoka, whose demeanour is very controlled in comparison to her animated self, I've been trying to get to the bottom of what it is that's missing from her. I was reminded of her snarkiness, or to be correct, her snippiness from early seasons. It's how she got the nickname Snips after all, but it's entirely lacking in these episodes too. Ahsoka's character development turned her from an immature teenager into a mature young Jedi. But the snippiness is gone here. Same for the rest of her episodes through the rest of the Clone Wars and into Rebels. Live-action Ahsoka is here already. The thing that's missing is Ashley Eckstein, who's been with this character, playing her since the mid-2000s. It's her that's the through line for Ahsoka, from the Clone Wars to the Rise of Skywalker, who made up for letdowns in the plots. She plays the part of Ahsoka playing the part of a slave really badly, really well. But it's just a shame that this story was rewritten to kind of take away all these interesting character moments, that she doesn't really seem bothered by the fact that her own people are being enslaved, that she doesn't take her master aside and say, "Master, I'm really struggling. Seeing them in chains is a pretty confronting thing. I'm wrestling with my emotions, not to make this personal." I didn't love the comic. It's definitely not my favourite from the old Star Wars canon, but I still liked it. And reading it for the first time, it's such a great flashback to reading the Dark Horse collections in a school library. It's filled with some genuine shocks and incredible levels of brutality, and these don't necessarily make it better, but they at least got reactions from me and kept me guessing as to what was coming next. The character interactions were great and consistent throughout, and I ended the series feeling like they'd changed and reached greater understandings of one another, and that did colour my perception of them going forth into the series and other stories featuring them. I'm not entirely sure if the tragedy around Roshti's quest for peace failing was totally intended, but I did pick up all this sarcasm and satire within, so they gave the story a lot more weight. The animated episodes are major letdowns, lacking some of the best moments of the comic as well as character, and to learn that this far into the partnership and their friendship, Ahsoka doesn't know or get along with Anakin as well as we assumed she did, that's a massive disappointment, as is the rather simplistic ending. Roshti's just like, "Oh well, I guess we'll join the Republic war machine." It's pretty bleak, and it just feels like the writers don't realise it is as bleak as it comes across. It's almost like it's presented like it's a good thing, that these people had to go through this, and that sure, they came out the other side, but isn't it a shame that it happened at all? It's, "Oh well, no, move on, whatever." So yeah, I just don't really know what the writers were thinking, and it's the same guy who wrote both versions. I mentioned the brutality present within the comics. I don't think it's good or bad. It was a bit of a surprise and it raised the stakes for me as I read. But the animated episodes feature some similar moments that I think overstep the boundaries of good taste for a program like this, like when the Queen's slave and would-be assassin leaps over the railing. The animation decides to show us the aftermath. It's not gory at all, but it feels really inappropriate for a program that's intended for audiences young and old. This is a show with wars in the title, twice, so I'm not objecting to violence or tackling such themes. It's just in this case it felt especially brutal for Clone Wars to depict. There's a time and a place for these kinds of things, and I have to ask if this was really the time or the place to do that.
It was clear to me back in 2008, and especially clear to me now, that the only real reason this story is remembered is because it sexualized a 14-year-old girl. For such a dark, unpleasant, and frankly seedy story, I'm not entirely sure why they thought this was appropriate for what was basically a kids' show. Sure, you can address all the slavery concerns around Anakin's character, but there's got to be a better way to do it than this. You can find copies of the Slaves of the Republic comic available for purchase on online book retailers, and the episodes available to view along with the rest of the series on Disney+. Not sponsored. I was thinking of getting a Patreon, and if you're interested, let me know. Thank you for listening. I'm Royce, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.